Hey you and welcome. My name is Mike and get this, Bryan Patrick Miller was a real-life zombie hunter. Self-proclaimed, and I don't think he actually hunted zombies because, well, you know, but he did hunt other things. Bryan Patrick Miller was a guy who hid under the guise of a local celebrity. I mean, people would post memes about seeing him around in Phoenix, Arizona. He wasn't a cop or anything, just a local character. Unfortunately, no one knew what his real character was. Something he hid for decades, striking again and again. Before we get into it, please subscribe to see new stories for the dark every single week. Now let's give it a go. In 2013, a young woman named Adrian was in her apartment in Tempe, Arizona, an apartment she shared with her closest friends, and they were all about to throw a huge party. Now, Adrian was an aspiring journalist. She was smart, she was motivated, and she was very responsible. The party they had that early June night, it was crazy. I mean, it was a small apartment with maybe 3 bedrooms. 40 people showed up, all dressed up. The music was blaring. Beer was everywhere. The party was hardcore. The TV was smashed. An ottoman was taken out and set on fire in their front yard. But 19-year-old Adrienne was not in the partying mood that night. She was upset, and from all accounts, it appeared she was upset with her boyfriend, Francisco, when she found him flirting with another woman. Adrienne and Francis were childhood sweethearts. And whether this was a serious issue or just something like exacerbated by alcohol, God only knows. But I mean, they were 19 years old, so there's always some kind of drama. So at 4 a.m. on June 15th, Adrienne, who had spent the majority of the night in her bedroom by herself, she walked out of her bedroom door, she walked through this crazy party where beers everywhere and the music was pounding, and she walked out the front door. She got into her car and she started driving to her boyfriend's place. But along the way, she got into a car accident. It was a single car accident, and as you can see though, she did enough damage for one morning. Then, after just leaving her car on the side of the road, she walked back to her own apartment, again through this giant party which was blaring. She went into her room, she changed her clothing, and she called a cab. She was texting Francisco the entire time, telling him, "I'm coming over," something which he was none too keen about, as they were in the middle of this huge fight, and he was like, how about no crack? That sounds like no crack. But at 5 a.m, she said she was walking to the cab right now. She had arranged for a cab to pick her outside a nearby convenience store, which is only a couple minutes walk away. She was texting the cab driver saying she would be waiting outside. And so that hot summer's night, things were extremely quiet. Nobody was around. This is 5 a.m. And the cab driver noticed there was no one around. He pulled up outside the convenience store and there was nobody there waiting for him. There was no sign of Adrienne at all. He tried calling her, but her phone was off. And her boyfriend Francisco would say she never showed up at his place. Now clearly something was very, very wrong that night. Adrienne must have been very upset and probably a little bit drunk. She was always described as somebody who was very irresponsible, so getting behind a wheel of her own car, well maybe she'd had a few beers, is not a good idea. Thankfully it was only a 1-car crash, but that probably would have made her even more upset. Maybe during that walk, another car pulled up or she'd bumped into somebody and agreed to something she normally wouldn't have. And so, after nobody heard from her for a couple of days, the search began. Her father, Rick, he was leading the charge, and an investigation into her mysterious disappearance began.
And with breaking news right now coming out of Tempe, right now police officers are scouring the area near 5th and Hardy. They're looking for 19-year-old Adrian Salinas. That's her photo right there. The teenager disappeared 2 weeks ago near Tempe Town Lake. The Gateway Community College student was on her way to her boyfriend's house, but never made it.
What had happened? I mean, she was only walking a couple of minutes away, and it was an extremely quiet time of the morning. There would have been little to no people around, and anybody who was around, who knows what they were up to. Her boyfriend, Francisco, questioned the cab driver. He was questioned, both, as you can imagine, probably 2 people who would be most likely to see her, but both were questioned and then cleared, released without suspicion. So what could have happened to her? I mean, one thing I'm thinking of is, could she have gotten into the wrong cab? Well, these were all questions asked for weeks until early August, about 2 months after she mysteriously disappeared. a call came in. A man reported finding human remains on his property in Apache Junction, which is about a half-hour's drive away from where she would have been living. He stumbled across it because, well, he had suddenly seen a load of vultures in one particular area on his own piece of endless Arizona desert. He'd walked over, the sun was beating down, flies were everywhere, and he saw what the vultures were chomping at. The police arrived and could confirm it was human remains, and DNA results would identify it was, in fact, Adrian Salinas.
Before it was just a body and it was like, this is sad. Now that there's a face to it, I don't like it, so I really feel for the parents. I mean, my daughter's 19. Could have been her, could have been her friend.
There had recently been flash floods in the area, so what they think happened is she had been buried in the desert, but then the sudden rush of water washed her body away to where it was found, first by vultures, then by people. Now, though, when she was taken in, the autopsy results were inconclusive. She'd been gone too long and the vultures had been at her, so it was impossible to tell how exactly she died. She was missing limbs, but there was no way to tell if that had been animals or if that had been, whatever happened to her. So what happened was inconclusive, but it also was treated as a homicide from the very get-go. There was no direct evidence to support that, but the police were like, there's no way she got out here by herself. And so the case went cold. Years I'm talking past. 2, to be exact, before a major tip came in regarding the mysterious disappearance of Adrian Salinas. A man was linked to her disappearance, a guy who loved cosplaying as this steampunk zombie hunter. But this guy was secretly a serial killer, which is almost as bad as being a cosplayer. I'm joking. The person who called in the tip was named Keen, and he told the police he had met Bryan Patrick Miller at a steampunk convention a couple of years before. Bryan had the costumes, and he was a local celebrity. He even had a decommissioned police car, covered with all sorts of decals and complete with a zombie in the back. Now, the real-life Bryan was a divorced father who worked at an Amazon fulfillment center. A normal, quiet guy by all accounts, someone who was uncomfortable around women, and who loved taking on the persona of the zombie hunter. Whoa, Bryan, leave some chicks for the rest of us. People always said, that's how you meet Bryan. Not the real guy, you meet the zombie hunter first. See, he could really be himself, when he was cosplaying. The only problem was that in Bryan Miller's head, replace zombie hunter with women hunter. He was not cosplaying. This is who Bryan Patrick Miller really wanted to be. Angela Brasso was 21 years of age in November 1992. She was a good employee where she worked. No one had any issues with her at all. A lovely, young woman who, on the evening of November 8th, which is the day before she was due to turn 22, she was cycling along the Arizona Canal in North Phoenix. This was something she did all the time, very regularly, and it would take her a little bit over an hour to do her usual circuit. In fact, her boyfriend, he always went with her. They would cycle together, but he didn't go with her this particular night because it was her birthday the next day and he decided to stay home so he could bake her a birthday cake. This time though, she never returned from that bike ride. Her boyfriend, Joe, he began worrying. She should be back by now, and so he went out to this canal to look himself. Saw no sign of her, and that's when he called the police. The very next day, her body was found along that canal. She was naked, and she had been decapitated. Her chest had also been cut open. It was gruesome. It was believed she had been just calmly biking along when someone jumped at her in the dark, pushed her off her bike, and dragged her off the path. Then, with a short blade, cut her open and cut her head off. Her head wasn't there, though, and the bike was also missing. over a week later, a guy was walking along the canal, minding his own business, when he just looked into the canal and saw right on one of those canal grates a severed head bobbing in the water. What was even freakier about this was that the head hadn't decomposed at all, meaning that whoever cut her head off had taken the head, had kept it in a cooler, had frozen it, doing as a souvenir, doing God knows what with it, before coming back and throwing it in the canal. This was a gruesome one in its depravity, and a stunning one in the fact that they had no clues or evidence to go off of at all. Then, 1 year later, the same thing happened again. On September 22nd, 1993, 17-year-old high school student Melanie Burness was, once again, biking along that same canal. The killer there, perhaps, thinking to himself, reminiscing on what he had done just 1 year before, and then he saw his opportunity again, and he took it. Melanie was cycling along, the killer pushed her off her bike, and she had been stabbed to death. Her bike was missing also. She wasn't decapitated, and her body was found floating in the canal. But once again, they had absolutely nothing to go on. They were looking at similar cases, across America, decapitations. They were even looking at a suspect in France. That's how far they were trying to reach to try and solve this, what became known as the canal killings. But nothing. No leads whatsoever. Wouldn't be for 22 years. Then this little thing called technology caught up. In 2015, DNA was finally able to crack the case, and that is when the name came up. The name being Bryan Patrick Miller. It was genealogy that solved it. Again, it's always these Ancestry.com, genealogy.com, all these websites. Well, that solved this one. It found the name Miller. And then they were able to narrow it down who lived in the area, the age. They got him.
It was as brutal as it was perplexing. Two young women, 22-year-old Angela Brasso and 17-year-old Melanie Burness, found dead, their bodies mutilated.
But just as suddenly as those murders started, the crime stopped without an arrest. Until now. Tonight, after more than 20 years, a Phoenix man is behind bars accused of both murders. This is 42-year-old Bryan Patrick Miller as he made his initial appearance in court today. Tricia Hendricks joins us live from the suspect's home in North Phoenix, where police made that arrest after searching his property last night. Tricia?
Mark Lindsay, finding the person who murdered those two young women was one of the top priorities for Phoenix police more than 2 decades ago. Now it's once again keeping detectives busy, all because of DNA evidence. The arrest may offer some closure for the family members of two young women, both victims of brutal murders more than 20 years ago. Their bodies found in the Arizona canal less than a year apart.
Bodies found murdered and mutilated in both of these different cases, and so certainly one that got a lot of attention.
But this wasn't Bryan Patrick Miller's, the first time his name came up for the police. In 1989, when he was 17 years old, he was in the parking lot of a local mall when he grabbed a knife and stabbed another teenage girl. He stabbed her in the back. It's believed it could have been, or probably was, a random attack. He was done for attempted murder. He was sent to a juvenile facility for 1 year for that one. He was also linked, or has been considered, a person of interest in the disappearance of 13-year-old Brandy Myers. She vanished in Phoenix, Arizona on May 26, 1992. She was just walking outside her home when her sister lost sight of her, gone in a flash. Bryan just so happened to live around the corner, and this just so also happened to be in the same area where the canal murders would occur. That day, she was out collecting pledges for her school readathon, and then she was gone. So not only did he live in the area, his ex-wife, Amy Miller, she would come forward to the police when he was later arrested in 2015, telling the police a story he had told her. He told her the story of how one day a young girl just knocked on his door. He opened it, grabbed her, dragged her in, and stabbed her to death before slitting her throat. He then put her body into the bathtub in his house, and he started running cold water over her to try and preserve her for as long as possible. After a couple of days, the neighbors began complaining about a smell, and so he chopped her body up, put her into garbage bags, and just left her out front of his place like any other regular trash, the garbage men came and they took her away. As you can imagine, this is insane. And the only reason his ex-wife didn't come forward sooner was that she was worried she too would be next. Now, this whole story of linking him to Brandy Myers' disappearance, and there's a fair bit to go on, but it was circumstantial. And so when it was forwarded to the prosecutor's office, they declined to press charges on it, basically saying they didn't believe it would lead to a conviction. But in 2015, Bryan Patrick Miller was arrested and charged with the canal killings, as they're known.
How can you explain to me that your DNA is there?
I can't. I can't remember everything I did back then, but I know I didn't kill anyone. I've never killed anyone. When I was a teenager, I stabbed that woman.
Right.
You know, that haunted me for years.
Possible that you could have blacked out and done something like that to somebody and not recall?
No, because I knew I had done something when that happened. I used to remember her name. I think the hard part for me to believe is if my semen is with someone, well, two people that are dead.
That's pretty strong evidence. It places you with these women, and you can't explain that.
And I don't even recall them. I don't know their name. I don't know what happened because I was.
You have to know what happened.
No.
Your semen is there. That's the only person that does know is.
But as I said, Bryan was a local character, a local celebrity. His cruiser, the zombie hunter mobile, known around town. He was at horror conventions, steampunk movies, all that. He was also a crazy hoarder. When people visited, he would only allow them to stay in certain rooms, certain parts of his home. And when the police were searching his house, it was a giant shitbox. So how does all this link back to Adrian Salinas back in 2013? Well, after Bryan was arrested, a friend of his contacted the police, citing a number of similarities between her disappearance and his other victims. Apparently at the time of Adrian's disappearance, he was going through a massive depressive episode, and he was venting all the time to people online about his issues with women. The morning Adrian disappeared, Bryan had been actually trying to organize that morning like a hike or a biking. He had posted a few days prior on social media. Okay guys and gals, I'm giving you several days notice. Someone get out of bed early and off their lazy butts and join me for a hike, a walk, or a bike ride on Friday or Saturday morning. Talking 6 to 7 a.m. start time. If Bryan had been up and around at that time, well, that was the same time Adrian disappeared, and he lived very, very close to her. He also apparently knew Apache Junction really, really well, which is the area her body was found. He would go hiking out there all the time. So in 1989, there was an attempted murder. Then in 1992, Brandy disappeared, and he's been strongly connected to that. Then also in 1992 and 1993, you have the canal killings, and then in 2013, you have the disappearance of Adrian Salinas. So that's a hell of a long gap, right, between 1993 and 2013. Well, just so happened that in 1994, for a good couple of years, Bryan moved out of state and he moved to Washington. He was living in Everett, Washington, and there you'll find a large number of unsolved, brutal homicides that seem very similar to what he did at the canal. In 2002, a woman was out walking in Everett when she accepted a ride from a man she recognized locally. It was Bryan Miller. During this ride, Bryan took out a 12-inch knife and stabbed her in the back. The woman survived, and Bryan was arrested, but later acquitted after saying she had tried to rob him. He moved back to Arizona quietly not long after. It seems likely he could be responsible, and with the level of violence, I don't think he took any breaks.
All right, I need your full name and date of birth, please.
Bryan Patrick Miller, October 24th, 1972.
2 allegations of murder in the first degree, 2 allegations of kidnapping, 1 allegation of sexual assault. Is there anything that you want to say at this time? You do not have to say anything.
No, ma'am.
All right.
Bryan tried to plead insanity when the trials of Angela and Melanie finally went ahead in 2022.
That's Bryan Patrick Miller wearing a mask in court, now a middle-aged balding man, with the legal system trying to burrow into his brain, starting with testimony about the alleged unspeakable abuse by his late mother.
I don't recall if it was scissors or the knife that time, but started trying to attack him, saying that she was going to cut off his penis.
Miller's attorneys claim he suffers from an alphabet soup of diagnoses.
He didn't and couldn't deny that, he hadn't murdered them. I mean, in fact, his DNA being found on both their bodies you couldn't explain that away. But what he was trying to argue, and what his defense was trying to argue, was that at the time of the murders, just so happened to lose my mind at that specific moment. I had like a break from reality. Didn't happen before or after, just at those 2 moments. The trial was a bench trial, meaning there was no jury, just a judge. And at the end of it, after 6 long months, in the spring of 2023, Bryan was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and attempted sexual assault.
Good afternoon. I am not looking for sympathy today. This time is for the family and the friends of the victims. I cannot imagine what pain they have endured for all these years.
Bryan Patrick Miller stood next to his lawyer in front of Judge Suzanne Cohen as he spoke.
I know this has been a long and painful process for everyone. I wish I could provide answers to the questions you have. I know I am different. I didn't understand completely why. I thought it had to do with what my mother did to me.
Bryan Patrick Miller, the zombie hunter, he was sentenced to death.
There is no question that what the defendant did deserves the death penalty. The question the court must answer is if the totality of the mitigation is sufficiently substantial to call for leniency. The answer is no.
To date, the remains of Randy Myers are still missing, and the case of Adrian Salinas remains unsolved, and it's still open. Though in both there is a very strong and likely suspect, though unfortunately also in both there is not enough to go on, and Bryan, now that he's on death row, he ain't talking. Thank you so much for watching. I really, really appreciate it. As always, check out the That Chapter Patreon for early access videos and a whole host of exclusive videos. But until the next old video, please look after each other and look after yourselves, because I love you. Mike out.